Emma's words had barely left her lips before she saw the instant shift in Daniel's face. The air between them, already thick with tension, became suffocating. His jaw clenched so tight she thought it might crack, his hands curling into fists at his sides. For the first time in their marriage, she saw something in his eyes that sent a chill down her spine. Not anger, not frustration, but something else. Something darker. He didn't yell, he didn't fight back, he didn't even defend himself. Instead, he did something far worse. He turned away. Without a word, he walked past her, his phone in hand, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Emma stood frozen, waiting for the inevitable door slam, the eruption of rage, anything to break the unbearable silence. But nothing came. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. And when she finally worked up the nerve to check on him, expecting to find him brooding in their bedroom, she stopped cold at the sight before her. The bed was untouched. The closet door was slightly open, and inside there was an empty space where his suitcase used to be. Daniel was gone. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know in the comments where you watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new one. Emma and Daniel had been married for 7 years, living in a quiet neighborhood in Austin, Texas. From the outside, they looked like the picture-perfect couple. Both had stable jobs, a well-maintained house, and a life that seemed enviable to those around them. Friends and family saw them as a solid unit, a marriage that had stood the test of time. They hosted dinner parties, smiled in photos, and went on vacations that made their social media pages look like a highlight reel of a happy, thriving relationship. But what no one saw, what even Emma herself didn't fully acknowledge, was the slow erosion happening beneath the surface. Their marriage wasn't broken in an obvious way. There were no dramatic fights, no major betrayals, no screaming matches that left doors slammed and hearts shattered. Instead, the damage was more insidious, creeping in through the little things left unsaid, the small resentments that festered over time, the quiet loneliness of lying next to someone every night yet feeling miles apart. The love they once had, the passion, the laughter that used to come so easily, had been replaced with something colder, something routine. Emma convinced herself this was normal. Every marriage had phases, didn't it? People grew comfortable, responsibilities piled up, and life got in the way of romance. This was just the natural evolution of being together for years. What she didn't see, what she refused to see, was that their love wasn't evolving, it was eroding. She chalked up the way Daniel withdrew after work to stress. She dismissed the lack of deep conversations, the way their once playful teasing had turned into dry sarcasm, as just part of being a long-term couple. If she felt unappreciated, unheard, unseen, she told herself it was temporary, that they'd reconnect eventually. She had no idea the storm that was about to come. Their arguments weren't loud, but they were constant. They didn't fight in fiery explosions, they fought in slow, steady burns that never quite went out. The bickering over small things, the groceries, the chores, the way he left his shoes in the middle of the floor, or how she always forgot to lock the back door, built up like layers of dust, settling into every corner of their relationship. Daniel, the strong, silent type, never let much show on the surface. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice or lost his temper easily. If anything, that made their fights worse. His silence always felt heavier than words, his indifference more cutting than anger. Emma assumed he was just detached, maybe even uninterested. But deep down, she still believed he was secure in himself, in them. What she didn't know was that Daniel carried wounds she had never seen, wounds he had buried so deeply that not even she, his wife, had ever been allowed to touch them. The distance between them had grown so gradually that neither of them fully realized just how fragile their connection had become. It wasn't until it was too late that Emma would look back and see the warning signs. The empty glances, the way he avoided intimacy, the way his laughter seemed less and less genuine. She would wonder how she missed it, how she let them slip so far apart. But that night, as she sat in their dimly lit kitchen, she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was just irritated. It was a typical evening. Emma stood by the sink, rinsing off the last of the dishes, her muscles tense from another long day. Daniel sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. The sight of him, so relaxed while she did everything, made something inside her snap. "You could help, you know," she muttered, not looking at him. He barely glanced up. "I had a long day," he said flatly. That was always his excuse. He was tired, he was stressed, there was always something. Emma rolled her eyes, slamming the cabinet door shut a little too hard. "Right, because I just sit around all day doing nothing." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples, already exhausted by the conversation he knew was coming. "Emma, not tonight." But she wasn't done. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. It's always the same, Daniel. I do everything. I clean, I cook, I run all the errands, and you—" He cut her off. "And I work 10 hours a day, Emma. I pay the bills. I take care of us in ways you don't even notice." The bitterness in his tone stung more than she expected. "And I don't?" she shot back. "You think this house runs itself? That food magically appears on the table? That everything just happens without me making it happen?" Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "God, you make it sound like I do nothing." Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you? Because honestly, it sure as hell feels like it." Silence, that thick, heavy silence that always settled between them when they fought. The kind that used to mean they'd step back, cool off, and find their way back to each other. But tonight, neither of them would step back. Tonight, that silence would be filled with something else. Something that would shatter everything. Emma didn't know it yet, but this was the night that would change everything. Emma's frustration boiled over, her grip tightening around the dish towel as she glared at Daniel, who was still sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone like her words meant nothing. The dishes were done, the kitchen cleaned, the laundry folded, everything in their home functioned because she made it function. Yet here he was, acting as if his long day at work excused him from doing anything at all. She didn't even want grand gestures, just some acknowledgement, some effort. But that never came. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the resentment had already taken root, pushing her over the edge. "You never listen, you never care, and I swear sometimes it feels like I'm talking to a damn wall," she snapped, throwing the damp towel onto the counter. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't look at her. "Here we go again," he muttered under his breath. That only fueled her anger. "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I ruining your peaceful evening? God forbid I ask for some help around here. God forbid I want a husband who actually gives a damn about something other than his phone." He finally looked up, his eyes cold, tired. "You think I don't care?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. "I work my ass off every day so we can live comfortably, so you don't have to stress about bills, so this house stays running, but somehow I'm the bad guy because I don't jump up and do dishes the second I walk through the door?" Emma scoffed, crossing her arms. "You don't jump up and do dishes ever, Daniel. You don't do anything. It's always me. I'm the one holding everything together while you sit there acting like bringing home a paycheck is enough." His expression darkened, his patience slipping. "You make it sound like I do nothing, like I don't contribute anything to this marriage." She threw up her hands. "Tell me, Daniel, what exactly do you contribute? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a man who takes and takes and takes." Something in him snapped at that. His phone hit the coffee table with a dull thud as he stood up, towering over her, his usual calm now laced with irritation. "And all I see is a woman who's never satisfied. Nothing I do is ever enough for you. You always have something to complain about, always nagging, always pointing out what I do." Emma's chest heaved, her breath coming short and fast. They had fought before, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. The words came out before she could stop them, fueled by months, maybe years of resentment. "You argue a lot for a man, no wonder you're so small down there." Silence. The air in the room shifted, heavy and suffocating. Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak. His whole body went rigid, his hands curling into fists at his sides. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes told her everything. The flicker of something raw, something deeply wounded. Not anger, not even shock, just pure, undiluted humiliation. For the first time in their marriage, she saw him not as the composed, unshakable man she thought he was, but as someone deeply vulnerable, someone she had just broken in a way that couldn't be undone. Daniel stood there for a moment, his entire body frozen, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he might crack his teeth. His hands curled into fists, then slowly released, as if he was trying to physically restrain himself from reacting. Emma braced herself for his response, expecting him to fire back, to yell, to throw something, to do anything that showed he was still engaged in this fight. But he didn't. Without a single word, he turned away, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was processing something far deeper than anger. He grabbed his phone off the coffee table, his face completely unreadable, and walked past her without so much as a glance. Emma felt the shift in the air, something almost suffocating, something that told her this wasn't just another fight. She waited, arms crossed, staring at the hallway where he had disappeared, expecting him to come back after a few minutes, maybe after slamming a door or cursing under his breath. She expected a storm, but all she got was silence. The minutes stretched on, turning into an hour. She paced the kitchen, replaying what she had said, half wanting to justify it and half knowing she had gone too far. Still, she told herself he would come around. He always did. He'd go for a drive, cool off, and they'd wake up tomorrow, go through the motions, pretend it didn't happen. That was how their fights worked. They pushed, they pulled, and then they moved on. But as the night wore on and Daniel never returned to the living room, a strange unease settled in her chest. She finally made her way to their bedroom, expecting to see him lying there, stiff and silent, his back turned to her like he always did when he was upset. But the bed was empty. She hesitated, listening for any sound, any sign that he was still somewhere in the house. Then she saw the sliver of light under the guest room door. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He had never slept in another bed before. Not in all their years together. No matter how bad their fights got, he had always been there, even if they were turned away from each other, even if the air between them was thick with tension. Her throat tightened as she stood outside the door, debating whether to knock, to say something, to take back what she had said. But her feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. She told herself to give him space, that he'd be back in the morning. But as she climbed into their empty bed alone for the first time, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something between them had just changed in a way that couldn't be undone. The days that followed felt heavier than any fight they had ever had. Daniel didn't storm out, didn't yell, didn't threaten to leave. Instead, he did something far worse. He shut down completely. Emma woke up the next morning expecting to see him in the kitchen, maybe still irritated, maybe distant, but at least present. Instead, she found an empty space where he should have been. She walked down the hall and saw the guest room door still closed. That had never happened before. She knocked lightly, waiting, hoping he would open it. He didn't. She tried the handle. Locked. That had never happened before either. A pit formed in her stomach as she turned away, forcing herself to go about her day like nothing had changed, but everything had. Daniel wasn't just angry, he was absent even when he was standing right in front of her. When he finally emerged later that morning, he didn't acknowledge her. No sarcastic remark, no clipped response, nothing. He moved around her as if she were a piece of furniture, something to be stepped around but never truly seen. At first, she tried to act normal, to pretend the night before had never happened. She made him coffee, setting it on the counter like she always did, but he didn't touch it. She asked if he needed anything, and he didn't even bother looking at her when he said no. By the second day, the weight in her chest had turned into full-blown anxiety. She tried to joke, tried to brush against him as she passed by, tried cooking his favorite meals, but nothing worked. His plate remained untouched, his eyes fixed on his phone or his laptop. His body tensed every time she got too close. By the third day, she realized something terrifying. He wasn't just ignoring her, he was erasing her. Emma couldn't understand why this time was different. They had fought before, had said awful things in the heat of the moment, but he had never reacted like this. She lay awake at night, replaying the scene over and over, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things shifted from anger to something deeper, something worse. And then, like a slow, creeping realization, it hit her. The way his face had gone blank, the way his entire body had stiffened, the way he had looked at her, not with anger, but with something that almost resembled shame. She had wounded him. Not in the way she thought she had, not just in a fleeting argument, but in a way that ran much deeper. She started piecing things together. She thought about how Daniel had never talked much about his past, how he had always been careful to avoid certain topics. And then, one night, in desperation, she found herself searching for answers in the only place she could, his old yearbooks, his social media, anything that might explain why he was acting like a man who had just had the ground ripped out from under him. That's when she found it, a thread of old comments on a buried forum post dating back to his high school years. Jokes, cruel ones, about something personal, something about him that had apparently spread through locker room talk. Her stomach twisted as she read the words, her breath catching as she realized exactly what she had done. She had reopened a wound that had never healed, a wound that had followed him into adulthood, into their marriage, into the way he carried himself. And now, thanks to one careless moment, she had torn it wide open again. Emma was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, lost in the weight of the silence that had settled between them over the past week. The house felt colder, emptier, like Daniel had already left even though he was still there, moving around like a ghost. She had tried everything, apologizing, acting normal, even trying to touch him, but he had withdrawn so completely that she wasn't sure she even existed to him anymore. Every night, the guest room door stayed shut. Every morning, he avoided her like she was something he couldn't bear to look at. Her eyes drifted toward his phone, lying face up on the bed, the screen lighting up every few minutes with notifications. He never used to be secretive about it, never took it with him everywhere, but now it seemed like he kept it close, always within reach. Another vibration. Another email. This time, the preview of the subject line flashed clearly across the screen. Regarding divorce proceedings. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, as if she had read it wrong, but it was still there, glowing in the dimly lit room like a death sentence. The air in her lungs turned heavy, her heartbeat hammering against her ribcage. Divorce? Her fingers twitched toward the phone, an instinct she had never acted on before. She had never been the type to invade his privacy, had never felt the need to, but this wasn't just a text message or some routine work email. This was the beginning of the end, sitting right in front of her, undeniable and irreversible. A door creaked down the hall, the sound of running water from the bathroom stopping abruptly. Daniel, he was coming back. Emma barely had time to process what she had just seen before the bathroom door opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway, rubbing a towel over his damp hair, his expression unreadable. She didn't give herself time to overthink it. Are you really divorcing me over one argument? The words came out sharper than she intended, but she couldn't hold them back. Daniel's movements stilled, his towel hanging loosely in his hands. For the first time in days, he looked at her, really looked at her. But what terrified her most was how empty his gaze was, cold, detached, like she was just someone he used to know. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. You think this is just about that night? Emma sat in the dimly lit bedroom long after Daniel had walked away, his cold words still hanging in the air like a noose around her throat. You think this is just about that night? He hadn't denied the divorce, hadn't even tried to argue. There was no anger, no fight, just a quiet resignation that scared her more than anything. She had thought this was about her insult, about the wound she had unknowingly ripped open, but now she wasn't so sure. Something else was beneath the surface, something she couldn't see yet, but it was there, eating away at their marriage. Over the next few days, Daniel barely came home. He left early, came back late, and when he did, he barely spoke. He never touched her, never made eye contact, never acknowledged her attempts to bridge the gap. It felt like she was watching the slow, deliberate dismantling of everything they had built, piece by piece, and she had no idea how to stop it. Then one night, Daniel came home past midnight, something he had never done before. He had always been predictable, a creature of habit, and late nights were never part of his routine. Emma had been lying awake in bed, her thoughts running in circles when she heard the front door open. The soft creak of it closing, the rustling of him taking off his jacket, the careful, quiet footsteps like he was trying not to wake her. A pit formed in her stomach. She lay there, unmoving, listening as he made his way down the hall, the guest room door clicking shut behind him. He never used to be this careful, never used to act like someone sneaking back into his own home. Something was wrong. The next morning, as Daniel showered, Emma sat on the edge of their bed, staring at his laptop on the desk. It was open but locked, the screen dark, the cursor blinking in silent defiance. She hesitated, the weight of invading his privacy pressing down on her, but the nagging suspicion in her gut was stronger. With shaking hands, she reached for the device, typing in the only password she could think of. Her birthday. The screen unlocked instantly. Her breath hitched. her heart pounding in her chest as she clicked through his emails, scanning for anything, any hint of what had changed. And then she found it. A folder buried in his inbox, one she had never seen before. She clicked it open. Emails, dozens of them, conversations stretching back for months. The subject lines alone made her vision blur. "Last night was amazing. I miss you already. Can't wait to see you again." She swallowed hard, clicking on the most recent one. "Olivia." Her blood ran cold. She scrolled through the messages, her fingers trembling. A coworker, someone he saw every day, someone who knew him, laughed with him, touched him in ways she hadn't in months. There were hotel reservations, late-night messages, inside jokes. He had been gone long before she had ever realized. And the worst part? She had thought she was the one who broke their marriage. She had thought her words had pushed him away. But Daniel had already left her a long time ago. She just hadn't seen it. Emma sat frozen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. The emails blurred in front of her as the reality of what she was seeing settled into her bones. Daniel hadn't just betrayed her. He had been betraying her. Long before their fight, long before her words cut him, long before she even suspected a fracture in their marriage, he had already checked out, already moved on, already made the choice to let another woman into the space that was supposed to be theirs. The devastation hit her like a slow, creeping poison, wrapping itself around her ribs, tightening with every new message she read. He had been lying, sneaking around, touching someone else while coming home to her, pretending, faking it. Every night he had looked at her with that blank expression. Every moment he had ignored her presence. Every sigh, every step away from her. It wasn't just about what she had said. It wasn't about that one fight. It was about the fact that in his mind, she had already been replaced. Her fingers curled into fists as the anger surged beneath the heartbreak. For days she had been blaming herself, punishing herself for the way she had hurt him, for the words she had thrown at him in the heat of the moment. She had spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how she could fix this, how she could make things right. But now she saw the truth for what it was. There was nothing left to fix. Daniel had broken them long before she had ever opened her mouth. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to break, not for him, not for this. Instead of grief, a quiet, calculated determination settled over her. She wouldn't scream, wouldn't throw accusations, wouldn't let him see her unravel. No, she would wait. She would watch. She took a shaky breath, closing the email folder and locking the laptop, leaving everything exactly as it was. She wouldn't confront him, not yet. Let him think she was still in the dark. Let him believe he had the upper hand. She had always thought revenge was petty, something bitter people did when they couldn't move on. But this wasn't about pettiness. This was about justice. Daniel thought he had won, that he had taken something from her, that she was just some woman he could cast aside and forget. He was wrong. She was going to make sure of it. Emma spent the next few days playing the role of the oblivious wife, keeping her routine steady, her expressions neutral, her questions casual. She didn't lash out, didn't cry, didn't show a single crack. Instead, she planned. The first thing she did was hire a private investigator. If Daniel wanted to sneak around and lie to her face, she would make sure she had every piece of evidence needed to burn his entire life to the ground. The investigator didn't take long to find what she already knew. Photos of Daniel and Olivia walking out of a hotel together, sitting too close at a bar, laughing in the kind of way that made Emma's stomach turn. Receipts, timestamps, messages, everything she needed to confirm that she hadn't just imagined it. It was real, and now it was documented. The next step was meeting with a lawyer, not to file, not yet. She wasn't going to let him escape this easily, wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a clean break. She wanted him to feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Wanted to see the moment he realized that he had lost, that she wasn't just going to quietly step aside. The lawyer laid out her options, gave her a path forward, but she already knew what she wanted. She wasn't just going to leave, she was going to take everything. She waited, patient and steady, keeping her anger contained like a storm just beneath the surface. And then, one night, the moment arrived. Daniel walked through the front door later than usual, his tie loosened, the faint scent of perfume clinging to him. He moved carefully, like a man who thought he was getting away with something. Emma was sitting on the couch, legs crossed, a glass of wine in her hand, waiting for him. She didn't look angry. She didn't even look upset. She just looked "So," she said, tilting her head slightly, watching as he set down his keys, "how was Olivia tonight?" Daniel froze. His back stiffened, his breath hitched, and for the first time in weeks he looked directly at her. His face went pale, his jaw tightening. "What?" Emma took a slow sip of wine, savoring the silence before setting the glass down. "I asked how Olivia was, the woman you've been screwing behind my back for months." He swallowed hard, his hands twitching slightly, as if debating whether to deny it or play dumb. He chose the latter. "Emma, I don't know what you're talking about." She let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. "Oh, Daniel," she sighed, reaching over to the coffee table and sliding a thick manila folder toward him. "You're going to want to sit down for this." His fingers hesitated before picking it up. He opened it, and as his eyes scanned the contents, photos, receipts, emails, all of it, his entire body sagged. His mouth parted slightly, like he wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came out. Emma leaned back against the couch, watching him. "You were leaving me anyway, right?" she said, voice deceptively calm. "The only difference is, now I get to decide how it ends." Daniel sat there, gripping the folder with white-knuckled hands, his eyes darting across the damning evidence, his breathing uneven. The weight of the truth settled over him, suffocating. Every late-night text, every secret rendezvous, every lie he had spun, it was all there, laid out in cold, undeniable proof. His mouth opened slightly, as if to form an excuse, a defense, but there was nothing to say. Emma didn't move, then blink. She watched him the way a predator watches prey, with quiet, patient amusement, waiting for him to process what had just happened. The power dynamic between them had shifted in an instant, and she knew he felt it. The man who had spent weeks acting like she no longer existed was now sitting in front of her, unraveling before her eyes. Finally, he looked up, his expression a mess of guilt and panic. "Emma, She cut him off before he could even try. "Don't." Her voice was steady, sharper than steel. "Don't insult me by pretending you have an explanation that matters." He swallowed, his throat bobbing, his hands tightening into fists. "It didn't mean anything," he said, desperation creeping into his tone. "It was a mistake. Emma let out a short, humorless laugh. "A mistake?" she repeated, tilting her head. "Daniel, you don't accidentally book hotel rooms. You don't mistakenly send texts saying you miss someone. You don't accidentally sleep with someone behind your wife's back for months." He had no response to that. She reached for her purse, pulled out a crisp stack of papers, and slid them across the table toward him. He stared at them, his face pale. "What is this?" She leaned forward, her gaze never wavering. "Divorce papers." Her voice was calm, emotionless. "You were leaving me anyway. The only difference is, now I decide how it ends." The silence between them stretched, thick with finality. Daniel reached for the papers hesitantly, flipping through them, his fingers shaking slightly. He swallowed hard, his gaze flicking up to meet hers. "Emma, please?" She stood up before he could finish, grabbing her glass of wine and taking a slow sip before turning away. "You should have thought about that before you made me your second choice," she said over her shoulder. He didn't try to stop her as she walked away. For the first time, Daniel truly understood what regret felt like. He tried over the next few days to get through to her. The texts started coming. Short, hesitant messages asking if they could talk, if she would just listen, if they could fix this. She never responded. Then came the calls, always ignored. He tried showing up, tried knocking on the door of the house he no longer belonged to, but she never let him in. The moment had passed, the damage was done, and now, as she walked out of his life without so much as a backward glance, he finally understood. Emma wasn't waiting for him anymore. She had already moved on. Emma walked out of that house with her head high, her spine straight, and her heart lighter than it had been in years. She didn't just leave Daniel, she left behind the version of herself that had once tolerated less than she deserved. The divorce was finalized on her terms, not his. She took the house, not because she needed it, but because he didn't deserve to keep it. She took the car, not because she couldn't afford her own, but but because he would have to start over with nothing, just like he had planned for her. And most importantly, she took back her dignity, the one thing he had tried to strip from her with his lies, his betrayal, his indifference. Daniel had tried to fight her on it, of course. He had come to the meetings with his lawyer, eyes hollow, shoulders hunched, looking like a man who had finally realized he had lost everything. But it was too late. The moment he had chosen Olivia over their marriage, he had made his decision. The only difference was that now, Emma was the one writing the ending. The last time she saw him was in the courtroom, where he sat across from her, barely able to meet her gaze. When the judge stamped the final approval on their divorce, she didn't feel sadness, she didn't feel loss, she felt free. As she walked past him on her way out, he opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. She didn't stop, she didn't look back. Some betrayals aren't worth forgiving. Some men don't deserve a second chance. Some women aren't meant to be broken. Emma had spent years thinking that love meant sacrifice, that marriage meant enduring the hard times no matter how much they hurt. But what she learned, what she had been forced to learn, was that not every battle was worth fighting. Not every man was worth saving. She had given Daniel everything, and when she had finally asked for something in return, he had turned to another woman instead. He had taken the easy way out, believing that Emma would always be there, believing that she would always fight for them, no matter how much he pulled away. But he had underestimated her. She didn't just survive his betrayal, she thrived because of it. She built a new life, one that didn't revolve around trying to fix a man who was never truly hers to begin with. She started traveling, something she had always wanted to do but had put off because Daniel never seemed interested. She went back to painting, a passion she had abandoned when marriage and responsibilities had taken over. She started saying yes to things she had always denied herself, and no to anyone who made her feel like she was difficult to love. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't thrive. He didn't get the happily ever after he had probably imagined with Olivia. Whatever they had fizzled out quickly, burned by the reality that affairs never translate into real love. He tried dating again, but nothing stuck, and every now and then, Emma would get a message from him, an attempt to reconnect, a pathetic reach into the past, a weak "I miss you" that she never acknowledged, because Daniel was her past, and she had no intention of ever looking in that direction again. If you were Emma, would you have forgiven him, or would you have done exactly what she did? Let us know in the comments. Never let a man decide your worth, and never stay where you aren't respected. Like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories. See you next time.